Hey there! Thanks for tuning into Duck Bricks. I'm Chris, aka the Brick Archivist, and today we will be taking a look at the top 10 LEGO Ninjago fight sequences from all 13 seasons of the show that are currently out. When you're watching any sort of animated show, the key thing you want to see is if the action is visually interesting and inspired. Over the course of its run, Ninjago's animation style and fight choreography have drastically improved. We went from the most dramatic and serious fights looking like this, to this. As a brief historical rundown, Ninjago received a massive budget boost for Season 4, Tournament of Elements, which allowed them to better choreograph fight scenes, and even animate water much better. In Season 8, after the Ninjago movie, they received yet another animation upgrade, but most of the budget this time went into hiring a secondary outsourced company to produce beautiful renders of locations and landscapes, and fight choreography remained much the same. It wasn't until Season 11 when the animation studios switched from Willfilm, a Danish in-house company, to a more well-known Canadian company, DHX Studios, or Wildbrain Studios as it's called now, when the fight sequences were upgraded and boosted dramatically. As such, don't expect to see anything before Season 4 on this list. There's just too much good stuff to pick from after that. But without further ado, let's move on to number 10, Lloyd vs. Garmadon, from Season 8, Sons of Garmadon. This fight is almost 5 full minutes of action with barely any cutaways for reaction shots or breaks in the fight for dialogue. If the action continued to impress and showcase interesting animation, this could potentially be a really good choice. But unfortunately, by the second or third minute, it just starts to feel a little stale. There's nothing particularly unique about the environment. They're fighting in a deserted prison, so any scenario or location within the prison that they duel in is more or less the same. Given that this was animated by Willfilm and not DHX, the elemental energies they use in their fight aren't really that flashy or entertaining. Sure, Garmadon glows purple from time to time and Lloyd's hands glow green, but besides that, there isn't really any spectacular use of elemental abilities on display here for such a long fight. To top it off, there are a few animation and shot continuity errors that cause Garmadon to inexplicably stop glowing for certain frames and scenes, and overall, while any chunk of this fight can be considered as a decent Ninjago fight, it just goes on for way too long and doesn't try to do anything different with the runtime it's been allotted. But moving on to number 9, we have Kai and Nia versus the Time Twins, from Season 7, Hands of Time. Say what you will about Hands of Time and its other animation and story issues, the fight scenes were not one of its problems. Most of the fight sequences in this season, even the ones we aren't discussing today, are visually engaging and had fast-paced blows. Despite starting off a little odd, with Kai jumping on a wheelchair for seemingly no reason other than to get pushed to a plot-relevant portrait in the museum, which is more emblematic of writing issues than anything, as soon as Nia joins the fight, the action is ramped up to 11. Ignoring the awkward dialogue that plagued this season due to its temporary writing staff, it's very easy to get drawn into the action, and having the two sibling teams duel each other and switch off opponents was a great idea. I only wish there was a little more to differentiate the combatants. Kai uses fire like once, and it doesn't seem to have that much of an effect, and despite their vastly different personalities, the Time Twins are more or less identical combat-wise. They don't let their personalities show during a fight, which is one of the larger problems with the Willfilm Ninjago fights. They all tend to start looking the same after a while. When I watch a fight sequence, I'm looking to see how the individual personalities of the combatants show. What are they thinking or feeling in that exact moment? That being said, this still has a lot of energy with arguably even more varied blows and fresh combat than the previous one, given that it focuses on 4 characters instead of 2. Coming in at number 8, we have Klaus vs. Nia. Almost the antithesis to the 5-minute Lloyd vs. Garmadon fight, Klaus vs. Nia is much shorter and takes a unique approach by changing up the scenery and giving Nia a completely different objective than just victory. She wants to escape. The scene begins with a direct homage to Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Some scenes are even copied shot for shot, and as such, it gives us something unique and new that no other Ninjago sequence really comes close to. While Nia is fleeing Klaus and the guards for most of the fight, when she is forced to clash with him, the action is short and sweet, with quick hits and blows trading back and forth before breaking off again to attempt escape. The only downside to this fight is that there's almost too much running, and since the emphasis is on Nia fleeing, it feels more like a chase with smaller fights scattered throughout, rather than a full-on spectacle. The other thing is that pacing is a tad off. Klaus has the upper hand, but then Nia kicks him back and jumps off the balcony. Why didn't Klaus continue to chase her? Instead, he had minions sent after her right before the scene ends, which seems like a very odd choice given how it could have potentially worked out much better had she just simply given him the slip to end the fight rather than just clearly running off straight forward. But despite ending a little strangely, this was overall a great fight and a really interesting action sequence that we haven't really seen in Ninjago ever again. Moving on to number 7, we've got a very unique fight unlike any other we've ever seen and probably will see. Pixel versus the Preeminent in Season 11 Secrets of the Forbidden Spinjitzu. Regardless of how you feel of the story ramifications for the Preeminent being sucked out of the Departed Realm to engage in a kaiju mech fight, it's hard to deny that this fight is visually stunning. The monochrome classic Godzilla tone really gives this fight a unique flair, which makes total sense as the creator and co-writer of Ninjago, Tommy Andresen, is a massive Godzilla fan, and his passion and direction is clearly on display here. Complete with a nonsensical energy sword coming out of nowhere reminiscent of Pacific Rim, and this is our first massive scale Ninjago monster fight. The only reason why this one is a little lower on the list is the environment. The massive downgrade in terms of location, depth, diversity, and vibrance from Wilfilm to DHX is really on display here, and the forced emotional sacrifice that of course had no stakes for the main heroes was really unnecessary as well, and something Ninjago relies on a little too much. And finally, the biggest flaw with this fight is its place in the story. Not only did it interrupt the main story as pure filler, but it raised so many needless lore-related questions that at best significantly stretch and bend previously established lore, and at worst completely retcon some established facts. But moving on to our pick for number 6, we've got Lloyd versus Ice Emperor Zane, also from Season 11. I know that the community has a lot of negative opinions on how Zane's Season 11 arc resolved itself, and even the season as a whole. I myself share most of these thoughts. But to be completely agnostic of story relevance with Zane's Ice Emperor turn, I can still enjoy this fight due to the sheer energy and creativity in animation. While it's a pretty short fight, there's so much creativity packed into this, and it really showcases many of DHX Media's strengths as animators. Elemental powers are on full display, they are maximizing the throne room environment, and the characters are displaying their individual personalities and interjecting in dialogue without interrupting the flow of the fight. In terms of why this isn't higher on the list, the fact that it's almost too short and is interrupted by a lot of stuff happening in the middle of the episode don't paint it in the best light, and while the choreography was creative, there are a few awkward moments that don't seem quite right, and Ninjago has done some fights even better than this. Coming in at the halfway point, number 5 is Young Woo and Garmadon versus the Time Twins, again from Season 7 Hands of Time. Crux and the Chronics, despite being questionable villains at best, take yet another spot on this list. One of the best parts about this fight is that it is a flashback. That means limited pauses for unrealistic dialogue, characters we usually don't see fighting in their prime in full action, and an amazing accompanying soundtrack that is still one of the best soundtracks ever done for Ninjago to this day. Every action and movement and punch seems to have consequence, especially when we get down to the final few seconds when Wu and Garmadon literally break the Time Twins' swords in half from the force of their blows. The only major downside to this is the lack of elemental powers. The Hands of Time can literally pause, rewind, speed up, and slow down time itself, all things which would have given a massive advantage in this fight that they don't use until the end of the fight to shoot a time beam at Wu and Garmadon. That being said, I can see why they chose to go this route. They literally have another flashback right before this where they use all their powers and don't really fight hand to hand or with swords, so I can see why the writers chose a different approach here. That being said, I wish there was just some sort of story-relevant integration. It would have been as easy as saying the Chronosteel and the Time Blades was absorbing their elemental energies, preventing them from using their powers and forcing them to fight with swords, something that would have added a little bit more urgency to their combat and forcing the twins literally out of their number 4 pick is Zane versus Mr. E. This would be a lot higher if they kept the story relevance behind it and actually followed through with Mr. E being Echo Zane, but sadly it's instead just a really slick and cool fight sequence with a character that is largely irrelevant to Zane. That being said, onto the fight itself, and it is a good one. Zane uses his bow and arrows here as an opening attack, something we don't really see him use offensively that much, and only after he loses his bow does he start fighting hand to hand. When he realizes he has met his match, he powers up his elemental abilities to gain the upper hand, but Mr. E still breaks free. What's really cool about this fight as well is that Zane takes physical, visual damage. He gets more and more scuffed up during the fight, down to the point where panels on his chest are literally breaking apart and opening up, exposing his internal circuitry. This is really the only Ninjago fight that had lasting visual damage on a character, and that does wonders to propel it forwards past some of the other fights and adds yet another level of grit and realism to what is essentially two Lego figures punching each other repeatedly. As we move into the top 3, I will say that this is where DHX Media gets to shine. While I miss the landscapes and gorgeous scenery of Wilfilm, I can really appreciate the trade-off made to significantly boost the energy and visual flair of the character versus character action. With that in mind, we'll cheat a little bit with number 3 and give the point to any fight featuring Asphyra in Season 11. The fact that literally all of them are equally stunning and visually distinct from each other really showcases the power of the new studio, and there isn't really much I can say that's wrong with them. For the first one, seeing Kid Wu and Garmadon having a surprisingly really solid and fun action sequence was an absolute surprise and joy, and the first time we saw how a new form of Spinjitzu could take such life on screen. Asphyra and her cronies versus the ninja team in the museum for the second one is such an excellent take on a group fight. At no point is it only 1v1, and every time you can see something interesting happening in the background, like Jade charging up his lightning attacks to demolish some Pyro Vipers, while Lloyd and Asphyra wrestle over the scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu in the foreground. And finally, the big Asphyra Samurai Cave battle is still one of the best fights Ninjago has ever done, and really the first time that we as viewers could feel the sheer energy and power from a Spinjitzu attack done right. The few cutaways to reaction shots it allots aren't useless or draggy, like many of the other fights, and only serve to amplify the sheer power and force of the attacks. And as such, this easily takes a third place in the list, and it was really hard to put it in third, but the next two are just that much better. In our second to last place is Season 12, Lloyd vs. Harumi. This fight has it all. Emotion, action, even slow-mo done well. I never would have dreamed of a Ninjago fight looking anything like this back in the Wilfilm days. Despite having no elemental powers being used whatsoever, which is actually justified in story, this is some of the most engaging action ever in the show, which is doubly impressive given that the two characters are fighting purely with swords and nothing else. You can see the struggle within Lloyd as he forces himself to fight. He doesn't want to fight this image of Harumi, his last memory of her was her tragic death and slight redemption, and now he's being forced to fight this ghost of the past attacking with more ferocity than ever before. The health bars and video game aesthetic only further set this apart from other Ninjago fights, and the perfect ending of them both succumbing to their injuries and collapsing at the same time was the best possible way to end this almost classic samurai-esque fight. But anyone who has seen Season 13 can probably guess what's up next. Cole versus the Skull Sorcerer, and the long take crowd battles from the final 2 episodes of the season. Starting off with the long takes, these are simply put the most engaging and energetic group of action scenes Ninjago has ever done, period. Following a single spear or weapon as it's tossed from character to character and used in different and unique ways is a genius move, and these final 2 episodes delivered not 1, but 2 of these incredible long take fight scenes that seamlessly transition to the main event, Cole versus the Skull Sorcerer. Juggling 2 swords in the shield, Cole delivers the best action sequence of the series yet. You can feel his emotions as he remembers his late mother and gets excited with every sword swing and dodge. Combined with the skull acting as a wild card throughout the fight, constantly keeping Cole on his toes and swapping between attacks and dodges, and you have what's probably the greatest fight Ninjago has ever done. This fight has everything. A massive new Spinjitzu move to end the fight, emotional flashbacks, and excellent swordplay. But those are just my thoughts. What do you think? Do you agree? Disagree? Have any other suggestions for what be on this list? Let us know in the comment section below, and stay tuned to Duck Breaks for even more LEGO news, reviews, and analyses coming your way very soon. Thanks, and bye-bye for now.